ocean has always been a paradox, at once a giver of life and a merciless taker of it. For as long as humans have ventured onto its vast, restless surface, the sea has provided food, trade routes, and a pathway to discovery. Yet it has also demanded an unforgiving toll. History's waters are littered with the silent graves of ships and the echoes of human voices lost to the deep. It is here, where adventure meets uncertainty, that the greatest maritime tragedies have unfolded, shaping our collective memory and redefining the limits of human endurance. At first glance, the ocean appears gentle, a mirror reflecting the skies, a vast expanse of calm that promises safe passage and new beginnings. Beneath that surface, however, lies a power beyond imagination. The sea's temperament can change in an instant, turning a voyage of hope into a nightmare of chaos. Storms, invisible dangers, and the smallest lapse in judgment can transform a ship, whether an icon of luxury, a humble ferry, or a wartime vessel, into a drifting coffin. Some disasters are so staggering that they transcend their time, leaving indelible scars on the human psyche. These events remind us of the fine line that separates control from catastrophe. The names of the vessels, Titanic, Doña Paz, Wilhelm Gustloff, Sewol, have since become synonymous with the cost of overconfidence, mismanagement, and nature's raw force. Behind each of these names are stories of human lives, of parents clinging to children as fire spreads across an oil-slicked sea, of young students waiting for rescue that would come too late, of captains paralyzed by indecision, and of ordinary people who, in their final moments, rose to extraordinary acts of courage. For every statistic and every headline, there are thousands of unspoken tragedies, dreams that ended mid-voyage, and families left forever incomplete. Maritime disasters have always fascinated and horrified us because they are both deeply human and overwhelmingly uncontrollable. They unfold at the crossroads of human ambition and natural law. Ships are built to defy the sea. Captains are trained to anticipate its dangers. But when failure comes, through arrogance, negligence, or pure misfortune, the ocean reminds us of its dominion. This series of stories looks back at some of the most devastating maritime tragedies in modern history. From the unsinkable Titanic, torn apart by an iceberg in 1912, to the Doña Paz inferno in 1987 that left thousands dead in Philippine waters. From the wartime horror of the Wilhelm Gustloff, sunk by a Soviet submarine with over 9,000 lives lost, to the heartbreaking capsizing of South Korea's Sewol Ferry in 2014 that claimed the lives of hundreds of high school students. Each event exposes not only the fragility of human life, but also the consequences of human error and the immense, unpredictable force of the sea. 1. The Inferno of Doña Paz. On the night of December 20th, 1987, the sea off the Philippine coast lay calm under a moonless sky. Christmas was only a few days away, and the port city of Tacloban had already surrendered to the festive spirit. Colored lanterns dangled from balconies, churches overflowed with carols, and the streets pulsed with the excitement of travelers heading home. Among them was a river of humanity, each carrying bundles of gifts and food. All bound for Manila aboard a modest passenger ferry called Doña Paz. The ship was 24 years old, built in Japan in 1963, originally named Himayuri Maru. When purchased by Sun PCI Shipping in the Philippines, it was given a new name, Doña Paz. Doña in Spanish means lady, a noblewoman. Paz means peace. It was a hopeful, almost poetic wish that this vessel would sail in peace, honored on every journey it undertook. But on that fateful December night, peace was nowhere to be found. Official records said there were 1,518 passengers and 66 crew members aboard. In reality, the holiday season had swelled the numbers far beyond the manifest. Extra tickets were sold illegally. Children rode for free and were never counted. By the time the last bundles were loaded and the ropes cast off at 6:30 p.m., there were more than 4,000 souls packed into a ship built for a third of that number. Passengers sat shoulder to shoulder in the cramped cabins, spilled into the narrow corridors, and climbed up onto the open decks, where the humid air was at least breathable. Inside the crowd were people from every walk of life. Soldiers heading home to their families, mothers clutching infants, teenagers giggling over shared snacks. Among them was a 14-year-old girl named Valeriana, traveling with her employers to Manila, where she hoped to find work as a domestic helper and send money home. Another passenger, a man named Salvador, had bought black market tickets for himself and his daughter so that they too could be home for Christmas. As the ferry churned forward, the night swallowed its silhouette. Hours passed. By 10 p.m., the ship was gliding through the Tablas Strait. The sea was glassy, the air thick with salt. It was the kind of deceptive stillness sailors dread. Heading in the opposite direction that night was an oil tanker, MT Vector. It carried 8,000 drums of petroleum products, an enormous floating bomb. The Vector should not have been at sea at all. It had no valid radio license, no official operating permit, and an inexperienced crew. Some of the men were fast asleep. The two men left on watch were barely awake. The tanker's rudder had mechanical problems. Its crew believed the sea was empty. In the dead calm of the night, its huge, unlit shadow slid silently toward disaster. At 11:30 p.m., without warning, a dark mass loomed out of the night. On the Vector, a lookout shouted in panic. On the Doña Paz, there was no time to react. The tanker's steel bow tore into the port side of the ferry, punching a hole near the engine room. The impact was followed by a sound that survivors would never forget, a deafening metallic roar, like the world itself cracking open. Then came the fire. Oil spilled out like venom. A spark, a single spark, turned the entire scene into hell on water. The Vector exploded, its cargo of petroleum igniting instantly. Flames leapt across the gap between the two ships, racing over the decks of Doña Paz faster than people could run. Within seconds, the ferry was a floating torch. Inside, sleeping passengers woke to chaos. The lights went out. Smoke rolled through the corridors. Mothers screamed for their children. Some passengers, disoriented and barefoot, tried to find the stairs, only to be blocked by walls of fire. Others, half-blinded, clawed their way onto the deck. Life jackets were scarce. Many were locked away in storage cabinets, and in the panic, no one knew where the keys were. Those near the few open lockers clutched at the precious vests like gold. Everyone else faced a terrible choice: burn or jump into the dark sea below. Hundreds hurled themselves into the water, but even the sea offered no escape. The surface was slick with oil. When the fire spread across it, the ocean itself burned. The water boiled, scalding skin. And then, as if that were not cruel enough, sharks, drawn by the blood and chaos, began to circle. Those who managed to leap clear and stay afloat found themselves swallowed by a nightmare, surrounded by flames, choking on fumes, their bodies raw from the heat. In the distance, the black silhouette of the ferry was now a bonfire. Amid the terror, 14-year-old Valeriana, clutching a single life jacket given to her by her employer, was thrown by a wave far from the burning slick. For hours, she drifted in shock, listening to the cries around her until even the voices fell silent. By 3:30 a.m., the Doña Paz had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only floating debris and glowing embers. The MT Vector soon followed it to the bottom. Rescue did not come. No distress signal had ever been sent. There had been no working radios, no chance to call for help. As dawn approached, the first rescue ship arrived. Sailors pulled from the water just 26 survivors, 24 from the ferry, and 2 from the Vector. The rest, over 4,300 men, women, and children, were gone. The scale of the tragedy was almost beyond comprehension. It remains the worst peacetime maritime disaster in history. Whole families were wiped out. The ocean floor became a mass grave. The Philippine government launched an investigation that revealed a chain of failures: illegal overloading of passengers, lack of safety protocols, unlicensed operation of the Vector, and negligence in watchkeeping. Sun PCI Shipping maintained it had followed regulations, but the courts eventually ruled that the Vector's owners were liable. More than 3 decades later, in 2019, an American research vessel discovered the 2 wrecks lying in silence. The Doña Paz at a depth of 545 meters and the Vector 2.2 kilometers away. For the families of the dead, there was no closure, only the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments were filled with terror. For the rest of us, the story stands as a grim reminder of how complacency and greed can ignite a chain of events that ends in disaster. That night, the sea was calm, but the ocean has its own memory. And somewhere, deep beneath the placid waves of the Tablas Strait, the Doña Paz still lies, carrying with it thousands of unspoken stories of lives lost in the blink of an eye. 2. The Frozen Grave, the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster. January 30th, 1945. The Baltic Sea lay in the grip of a brutal winter. Snow fell in heavy curtains, muffling the distant thunder of artillery from the east. The Third Reich was crumbling. Soviet forces were advancing through East Prussia, leaving chaos and terror in their wake. For tens of thousands of civilians, women, children, the wounded, there was only one hope: escape by sea. Among the ships pressed into service for Operation Hannibal, a desperate evacuation effort, stood a gleaming, once proud vessel, Wilhelm Gustloff. Launched in 1937, the Wilhelm Gustloff had been a floating palace, a flagship of Nazi pride, designed as a luxury liner for workers and as a propaganda symbol of the regime. Its name honored a slain Nazi official, and its decks were once filled with holidaymakers, music, and the laughter of a Germany confident in its power. But now, in the last months of the war, the ship was a lifeline for those trying to flee the unstoppable Red Army. The liner's elegant white hull was chipped and streaked with rust. Her grand salons were packed with straw beds. She was no longer a cruise ship. She was a lifeboat, crammed to the breaking point. By the time the Gustloff prepared to leave the port of Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, Poland, on that freezing day, the quays were a scene of desperation. Families pressed forward, begging, bribing, clawing their way aboard. Mothers held out babies in their arms, praying for space. Soldiers, some wounded, some without orders, slipped onto the gangplanks. When the last gangway was pulled up, 10,582 souls were on board. The ship was designed for 1,900, The decks heaved under the weight of a human tide. 173 sailors, 162 wounded soldiers, 373 female naval auxiliaries, and nearly 9,000 civilians, among them 5,000 children, hidden deep in the holds. Sealed crates carried another cargo: gold, stolen art, and valuables plundered from Eastern Europe. But no one thought of treasure that night. They only thought of survival. At 12:30 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff sounded its horn. Escorted by a lone torpedo boat, the overloaded ship inched out into the frozen waters of the Baltic. Behind them, the port disappeared into a blur of snow. Ahead stretched a gray expanse of sea, its surface rimed with ice. Inside the wheelhouse, 5 captains, each with their own opinion, argued over the safest course. Some insisted on hugging the shallow coast to avoid submarines. Others argued for deep water. At last, Captain Friedrich Petersen made his fateful decision. They would sail into the deep open water. As night fell, the Baltic turned into a black void. Snow flurries swept across the decks. At 6 p.m., Petersen made another disastrous choice. Fearing collision with other ships in the dark, he ordered all navigation lights switched on. In an instant, the Wilhelm Gustloff became a beacon, glowing like a target on an empty stage. Lurking in the frozen darkness was Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko. For over 20 days, the S-13 had prowled the Baltic without success. When the periscope rose above the waves, Marinesko saw something impossible to ignore: a massive, brightly lit German liner. No Red Cross insignia, no disguise, and behind it, a torpedo escort. To Marinesko, it was no hospital ship. It was prey. At 9:16 p.m., Marinesko gave the order: fire. 4 torpedoes shot from the submarine like arrows. 3 found their target. The first torpedo struck the bow beneath the crew quarters, killing scores instantly. The second ripped through the swimming pool, where dozens of young female auxiliaries were resting. The third smashed into the engine room, silencing the ship's heart in an explosion of steam and fire. The Gustloff shuddered violently. Lights flickered. Within minutes, icy Baltic water poured through the gaping wounds. Passengers rushed from the lower decks, tripping over bodies, clawing at frozen staircases. Panic spread faster than the water. Above deck, lifeboats hung frozen to their davits. Men hacked at the ice with axes while people screamed below. In the chaos, rules meant nothing. Lifeboats designed for 60 were crammed with 100. Some snapped from their ropes and crashed into the sea, spilling everyone aboard into the dark. Inside, trapped behind warped steel doors, hundreds pounded the walls as the sea swallowed them. The sounds of fists and boots beating on the metals soon became muffled, then silent. The temperature was 18 degrees. Those who jumped or fell into the Baltic froze within minutes. Mothers clutched babies, their hair and faces crusted with ice. Soldiers waded waist-deep, trying to hold terrified children above the waterline. On deck, people fought to stay aboard even as the ship listed hard to port. Some prayed. Others sang hymns through chattering teeth. Many simply closed their eyes and waited for the end. Within 70 minutes, the Wilhelm Gustloff rolled onto her side and disappeared beneath the waves. The sea closed over the largest maritime evacuation ship of World War II, leaving behind only a scattering of bodies, wreckage, and the echo of 9,343 lives. Rescue ships arrived too late. The icy waters claimed most within the first half hour. Only 934 survivors were pulled from the frozen waves. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history, a tragedy overshadowed by the chaos of war, but staggering in scale. Its death toll was 6 times greater than that of the Titanic. Today, the wreck rests in 44 meters of water, 8 kilometers off the coast of Poland. It is marked as an official war grave, a site no diver is allowed to disturb. It lies there still, its rusting hull sheltering the memory of those who sought salvation, but found only a frozen grave. Beneath the ice of the Baltic, where silence reigns, the Wilhelm Gustloff remains a warning. Even the mightiest vessel cannot protect against the merciless weight of human decisions, the brutality of war, and the indifferent, endless sea. 3. Titanic, the unsinkable dream. April 10, 1912. The port of Southampton, England, thrummed with anticipation. A sea breeze carried the mingled scent of coal smoke and salt water as thousands gathered to watch the most celebrated ship of its age set sail, RMS Titanic. It was not merely a vessel, it was a statement of an era. The largest passenger liner ever built, stretching nearly 270 meters from bow to stern, Titanic was a floating city of steel and luxury. Her very name was chosen to suggest strength and immortality. Titanic, like the mythic giants who defied the heavens. Newspapers called her unsinkable. And so she left port with 2,223 souls on board, bound for New York. Inside, Titanic was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Marble staircases wound upward like gilded vines. Crystal chandeliers blazed. There was a heated swimming pool, a squash court, an electric elevator, and even a gymnasium. A marvel of technology for the time. The first-class dining rooms glittered with fine china and silver service, while deep below deck, coal stokers fed roaring furnaces that drove the ship forward at an impressive 22 knots. Among the passengers were some of the wealthiest and most famous people of the day. Millionaire John Jacob Astor IV, socialite Margaret Molly Brown, and industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim. But the ship also carried hundreds of emigrants, families with little more than a suitcase and a dream, bound for a new life in America. For 4 days, the Atlantic seemed like a promise fulfilled. The ship glided across a calm, endless sea. Passengers strolled on sunlit decks, danced to the sound of the ship's orchestra, and marveled at the speed and grace of the giant liner. Few paid attention to the wireless messages warning of icebergs ahead. As dusk fell on the 4th day, the weather was clear and unnervingly still. Stars hung like lanterns in a sky without a moon. The temperature dropped below freezing, but the sea was calm, a glassy black mirror. In the wheelhouse, Titanic's crew pushed the ship at near full speed, eager to make a record crossing. At 11:40 p.m., a cry shattered the quiet. "Iceberg, right ahead!" On the bridge, the quartermaster spun the wheel. Engines roared in reverse, but 46,000 tons of steel cannot turn on a whisper. The iceberg loomed out of the dark like a mountain, its white flanks glistening under the starlight. Moments later, the ship scraped along its submerged edge. Rivets popped like gunfire. Steel plates buckled. The iceberg gouged a jagged wound more than 90 meters long into Titanic's hull. At first, the damage seemed minor. No one screamed, no explosion, no smoke. But in the lowest decks, cold Atlantic water surged into the ship. 6 watertight compartments were breached. Titanic's designers had claimed she could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded. With 6, she was doomed. Captain Edward John Smith ordered the watertight doors sealed and summoned the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews. Andrews did a quick calculation and gave the verdict in a whisper. "She will sink in about 2 hours." Above deck, The passengers still believed the ship was invincible. The night was calm. The stars were beautiful. Some even laughed when ordered to put on life jackets. The orchestra kept playing, trying to keep panic at bay. But as the bow sank lower and the icy water crept higher, fear took hold. Crew members uncovered the lifeboats. Only then did the truth dawn. There were not enough lifeboats. Titanic carried 20, with room for just 178 people, barely half of those on board. At 12:25 a.m., the first lifeboats were lowered into the sea. They were half empty. Officers insisted on the rule. Women and children first. Husbands kissed wives goodbye. Some women refused to leave, choosing to die alongside their partners. By 1:30 a.m., the tilt of the deck became impossible to ignore. Plates and chairs slid across the floor. Water swallowed the grand staircase. Down below, the third-class passengers, many of them locked behind gates by regulations of the day, fought their way upward, clawing for survival. Wireless operators tapped out a desperate Morse code. SOS! Come at once! We are sinking fast! Miles away, the liner Carpathia answered, turning its bow through the darkness. But it was too far, too slow. As the minutes passed, lifeboats filled and the number of people left behind on deck grew. Some huddled in prayer. Others leapt into the freezing black water rather than wait for the inevitable. The musicians played one last piece, the hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee. At 2:18 a.m., just over 2.5 hours after the collision, the bow was completely submerged. The stern rose into the air, pointing like a finger at the stars. A terrible groan of metal filled the night. Titanic's spine snapped. The great ship broke in two. The forward section plunged into the abyss. The stern, briefly free, settled back level for a moment, and then began to sink vertically, sliding beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m. In that instant, the largest ship in the world vanished. What remained was an empty horizon and the sound of hundreds of voices crying out in the freezing dark. Rescue came at dawn. The Carpathia arrived to find only debris and 20 lifeboats, each carrying shivering, stunned survivors. 706 lives were saved. 1,817 were lost. Most of the dead perished not from drowning, but from the cold. The water temperature was 2 degrees. Survival time was measured in minutes. The Titanic disaster shocked the world. The unsinkable ship had sunk on her maiden voyage, taking with her some of the most powerful and the most humble of her time. The tragedy led to sweeping reforms: international ice patrols, mandatory lifeboat drills, and changes in maritime law. Yet even more than a century later, the story of Titanic endures because it is more than a shipwreck. It is a parable of human ambition and human frailty, of courage and cowardice, of love and sacrifice in the face of an indifferent sea. Beneath 12,000 feet of Atlantic water, the rusting hull of Titanic lies silently. But above the waves, her name lives on as a reminder. The sea has no master. 4. The Tragedy of the Sewol. April 16, 2014. Morning mist clung to the waters off South Korea's southwestern coast as the ferry Sewol cut through the gray sea on what should have been a routine voyage. On board were 476 people, mostly teenagers from Danwon High School in Ansan, excited for a 4-day field trip to the holiday island of Jeju. They had packed their bags with sneakers, cameras, and nervous laughter, ready to taste a small slice of freedom. For most, it would be their first trip away from home. For nearly all, it would be their last. The Sewol was an old ship, built in Japan in 1994, then sold to a Korean company and refitted with extra cabins to squeeze in more passengers. The modifications made it top-heavy, unstable. Inspections were lax. Paperwork was forged. For a bribe and a stamp, the ferry was certified safe. On that fateful morning, the cargo hold was packed with 185 cars and hundreds of tons of freight, much of it improperly secured. The weight sat high and uneven, a silent trap waiting to spring. At 8 a.m., the Sewol entered the narrow and treacherous Mengol Channel, a stretch of water notorious for its fast currents. The weather was clear, the sea deceptively calm. On the bridge, a junior third mate, inexperienced, stood at the helm while the captain rested in his cabin. At 8:49 a.m., she gave an order to change course. The helmsman twisted the wheel sharply. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the entire ship lurched. In an instant, the ferry tilted violently to one side. Cargo below crashed against the walls, breaking free from their chains. The sudden shift of thousands of tons of weight was like a hammer. The Sewol rolled harder, 20 degrees, 30, 40. The deck became a steep slope. Passengers stumbled, confused. The sound of breaking glass and twisting metal echoed through the corridors. Within minutes, the ship was leaning at a terrible angle. Water began to pour into the lower decks. At that moment, the ship could still have been evacuated. The students could have been led up to the deck, where lifeboats and rescue helicopters might have reached them. But the captain and crew froze. Over the loudspeakers came a calm voice. "Do not move. Please stay where you are." Believing they would be safer inside, hundreds of students obeyed. They stayed in their cabins, holding onto their bunk beds as the floor tilted beneath them. Above, the captain hesitated. 15 long minutes passed before the first Mayday call was sent. 9 a.m. Parents began receiving desperate text messages from their children. "Mom, the ship is tilting. What should I do?" "Dad, it's hard to stand. I'm scared." The ship was now leaning more than 50 degrees. Chairs, tables, and luggage tumbled through the corridors. Students, still trusting the crew's instructions, crouched in rooms as water crept up the stairwells. Some who dared to disobey scrambled upward, clawing along railings, trying to reach the deck. A few leapt into the freezing water, clinging to floating debris as they waited for help. At 9:30 a.m., the first Coast Guard boats arrived. By then, the Sewol was already lying on its side like a wounded whale. Helicopters hovered overhead, dropping ropes. Rescuers shouted for people to come up. But the order to stay put had never been countermanded. Hundreds remained trapped below. As rescuers pulled up the lucky few from the deck, the captain himself climbed into a waiting boat, leaving behind the passengers entrusted to him. At 10:17 a.m., the Sewol rolled over completely. Windows vanished beneath the waves. Air bubbles burst like sighs as water claimed the corridors and cabins. Inside, students clung to ceilings that were now walls, screaming for their parents, their voices muffled by rising seawater. By 11:20 a.m., only the stern was visible. A final piece of the ship sticking out of the water like a tombstone. An hour later, even that was gone. The sea had swallowed everything. Of the 476 people on board, 304 died, 250 of them teenagers. Only 172 survived. 5 bodies were never recovered. The nation watched in horror as the tragedy unfolded live on television. Parents stood on the shore, clutching their phones, praying for a miracle that never came. In the weeks that followed, the truth came out. The ferry was overloaded and unstable. Cargo was unsecured. The captain and most of the crew abandoned ship, leaving passengers to die. The government's rescue response was chaotic and slow. The country went into mourning. Yellow ribbons appeared across South Korea, symbols of solidarity with the victims. Vigils were held in every city. The names of the lost children, bright young lives, were read out in classrooms, their empty desks draped in flowers. The courts delivered justice. The captain was sentenced to life in prison for murder through gross negligence. Other crew members received long sentences. The ferry's operating company was shut down, but no sentence could undo what had been lost. The Sewol disaster became a national scar, a lesson written in salt and sorrow. It revealed the catastrophic cost of corruption and complacency, and how a single voice over a loudspeaker, wrong, hesitant, or cowardly, can seal the fate of hundreds. Every April since, the country pauses. At 10:17 a.m., the hour the ship capsized, church bells toll. Families bow their heads. And in those moments, the air seems to carry the whispers of the students' last text messages. "Mom, don't worry. They told us to stay put. See you soon." The sea remembers. Across the centuries, ships have been more than machines. They have been symbols of human progress, our longing for connection, and our belief that we can master nature. But the sea is a patient teacher. Again and again, it has shown us that arrogance, greed, and error have a price, and that price is often measured in lives. From the luxurious splendor of the Titanic to the crowded decks of the Doña Paz, from the wartime exodus aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff to the school trip aboard the Sewol. Each disaster tells the same haunting story. It is not only storms and waves that destroy. Often the gravest danger comes from ourselves. These tragedies did not strike out of a clear blue sky. They were born in chains of small choices. An extra ticket sold, a warning ignored, a light left on, a command given too late. And when those chains snapped, the ocean was waiting. Yet, in the face of catastrophe, the human spirit has also revealed itself. We remember the chaos, but we also remember the acts of courage. The passengers of Titanic who gave up their seats so others could live. The young girl Valeriana, clutching a single life jacket in an oil-slicked sea, refusing to surrender. The exhausted sailors who pulled the half-frozen from the Baltic, knowing there were too many to save. The teachers on the Sewol, standing in dark corridors, urging their students upward, even as the water rose. These moments, small as they are, shine like stars above the darkness. Every one of these disasters reshaped the rules of the sea. After Titanic, lifeboats became mandatory. After Doña Paz, regulations on overloading were tightened. The tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff became a grim lesson in the cost of war at sea. And after Sewol, South Korea rewrote its maritime safety standards from the hull up. But regulations alone cannot tame the deep. What is needed is memory and humility. Ships may be built larger, faster, stronger. Radios and satellites may watch the oceans. Yet when a decision falters, when complacency creeps in, the sea reclaims what is hers. Today, the wrecks lie silent. Titanic, rusting beneath 12,000 feet of cold Atlantic. Doña Paz and Vector, 545 meters deep in Philippine waters. Wilhelm Gustloff, a frozen grave in the Baltic. Sewol, raised but scarred, a monument to 304 lives. Each one is a reminder. The water closes over them, but the stories rise again and again. As warnings written in salt, For the sea forgets nothing, and it waits